Caleb Prescott stood alone in his spacious, dimly lit office, staring at a small, well-worn box he had pulled from his desk drawer. Inside lay a tiny, heart-shaped pendant with an intricate design on the front, a delicate, engraved rose surrounded by a protective circle. His fingers traced the cold, polished metal, and he closed his eyes, letting the familiar ache settle in. The pendant was the last tangible reminder of his daughter, Lillian. She had disappeared 18 years ago. When she was only 7, Caleb had given her the pendant as a birthday gift, promising her that he would always protect her, that she'd always be safe as long as she wore it. He remembered her delighted smile, her bright eyes as she looked up at him, and her little voice as she hugged him and said, "I'll wear it forever, Daddy." But forever had been cut cruelly short. Lillian had vanished without a trace, leaving him with nothing but questions, a deep sense of guilt, and an emptiness he could never quite shake. For years, he had chased every lead, consulted every expert, and put his entire fortune to use trying to find her. But despite all the effort, it was as if she had simply disappeared off the face of the earth. Caleb had built his life around the pursuit of answers. He was a man of precision, control, and authority in his world, wealthy, powerful, and respected. The kind of man whose presence could command a room with a single glance. His empire in the finance world had flourished, and yet, he could never bring himself to let go of that one unsolved puzzle, that one gaping hole in his life that all the success in the world couldn't fill. The whispers of doubt, the gnawing feeling that maybe he should have done more, lingered no matter what he achieved. He had tried to move on. He had remarried, traveled the world, and made enough money to last several lifetimes. But in those quiet moments, alone in his office or during sleepless nights, Lillian's absence felt sharper than ever. Some nights, he'd wake from dreams that she was still a little girl, running into his arms, laughing, calling him Daddy, and then he'd open his eyes to the silence of his empty bedroom, the sound of his own breath harsh and uneven, the dark reality crashing down around him once again. Tonight, it was no different. He held the pendant a little longer, letting his mind drift to memories of Lillian, and wondering for the 1000th time where she could be. Was she out there, somewhere, in trouble or afraid, or was she gone? The not knowing had been the worst part, an ache that time hadn't dulled, a wound that never truly healed. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Meredith, his wife, peeked in, her eyes full of concern. "Caleb," she said softly, stepping into the room. "Are you thinking about her again?" He nodded, his voice heavy with the weight of old grief. "It never really goes away, does it?" Meredith came closer, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. She'd been supportive through it all, patient and understanding, though Caleb knew his obsession had often made things difficult between them. Maybe it's time to let go, Caleb," she whispered, though she had said it many times before. He sighed, his fingers tightening around the pendant. "I don't think I know how, Meredith." She looked at him, her expression both understanding and sorrowful, and then she nodded, accepting his answer as she always did. "I'll give you some space," she murmured, brushing his arm gently before turning to leave the room. When she was gone, Caleb returned his gaze to the pendant. He felt the familiar mixture of anger and helplessness bubbling up again. He hated how powerless he was in this one thing, the only thing that truly mattered, and even after nearly 2 decades, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was still hope. However faint, with one last look at the pendant, Caleb slipped it back into the box and returned it to his desk drawer. He knew he couldn't keep living like this forever, hanging on to a shadow, to a memory. But each time he thought about letting go, the ache in his chest reminded him that Lillian was still his daughter, still the little girl who had once called him Daddy and promised to wear his gift forever. As he closed the drawer, his phone buzzed on the desk. It was a reminder for a scheduled appointment the next morning, a car dealership in downtown Austin. He'd been planning to surprise Meredith with a new car, a little gesture to show her his appreciation, perhaps to make up for all the nights he'd spent lost in thought, haunted by the past. With a sigh, Caleb picked up his phone, setting it to silent. He made a mental note to keep the appointment, if only to show Meredith he hadn't forgotten how much she meant to him. Maybe this small act would help him push aside the shadows of his past, if only for a little while. But deep down, Caleb knew the truth. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't let go of Lillian, Not yet. Not ever. The next morning, Caleb made his way to the dealership in downtown Austin as his driver pulled up to the glass-fronted building. Caleb felt a strange mix of excitement and duty. Buying a new car for Meredith was a gesture he hoped would show her how much he appreciated her, a small way to bridge the growing emotional distance between them. He stepped out of the car and adjusted his suit jacket, nodding briefly to the sales team waiting inside. The showroom was sleek and pristine, with cars lined up under the bright lights, each one more luxurious than the last. Caleb scanned the room, and his eyes settled on a young woman walking toward him. "Good morning, Mr. Prescott." She greeted him with a friendly smile. "I'm Emily, and I'll be helping you today. It's a pleasure to meet you." There was something about her presence, perhaps the easy confidence in her posture or the light in her eyes. She looked about the age Lillian would have been now, and for a brief, jarring moment, he felt the familiar pang of loss, but he quickly composed himself and shook her hand. "Thank you, Emily," he replied, his tone polite but reserved. "I'm here to buy a car for my wife, something elegant and dependable." Emily nodded, her smile widening as she led him over to a line of sleek vehicles. "We have several options that I think will suit her perfectly. Does she prefer sedans or SUVs?" "She likes sedans," Caleb answered. Trying to focus on the practicalities, he watched as Emily explained the features of each model with genuine enthusiasm, moving gracefully from one car to the next, her voice calm and confident. Caleb found himself impressed by her professionalism and warmth. They walked over to one of the cars, a dark blue sedan with sleek lines. Emily continued her explanation, detailing the luxurious interior and advanced safety features. Caleb was listening, but his attention drifted to her hands as she gestured toward the dashboard, and then, without thinking, his eyes fell to the pendant resting on her collarbone. The room felt suddenly smaller. Caleb's breath caught in his throat, and he froze, staring at the small, heart-shaped charm hanging from a delicate chain around her neck. It was the same pendant he had given Lillian on her 7th birthday, the one she had promised to wear forever. The world around him seemed to blur, his vision narrowing to the glint of the pendant against her skin. "Mr. Prescott, are you all right?" Emily's voice cut through his thoughts, and he realized he had been silent, staring. "Yes, I'm fine," he replied, clearing his throat. Though his heart was pounding, he forced himself to look away from the pendant, his mind racing. There had to be an explanation, but he couldn't shake the eerie feeling creeping over him. Where did you get that pendant, if you don't mind me asking?" Emily looked down, her fingers instinctively reaching up to touch the charm. She smiled faintly, a look of nostalgia in her eyes. "Oh, this. I've had it since I was a little girl. I don't remember much about my life before I was adopted, but I know that this was a gift from someone. I guess you could say it's one of the only things I have from my past." Caleb's chest tightened. He struggled to keep his voice steady. "How old were you when you were adopted?" Emily's expression softened as she thought back. "I was around 7, I think. My adoptive parents told me they found me with only a few belongings, and this was one of them. They said I was a bit of a mystery." She laughed softly, but there was a sadness in her eyes. Caleb couldn't tear his gaze away from her. The similarities were too strong, too uncanny. He felt a mix of shock and disbelief, his mind reeling. Did they tell you anything else about your past?" Emily shook her head. "Not really. I don't remember much, except that I think my name used to be Lily. I think that's what someone called me before I was adopted, but everything else is pretty fuzzy. It's strange, I know," she added with a nervous chuckle. Caleb felt like the ground was slipping out from under him. His heart raced, the weight of 18 years of searching and mourning pressing down on him with crushing force. He couldn't dismiss the idea that he was standing in front of his daughter. Everything in him screamed that this was Lillian, his Lillian, but he couldn't just say it. Not yet. "Lily," he murmured, as if testing the name. Emily looked at him curiously, and he quickly composed himself. "It's a beautiful name. Thank you," she said, though she seemed puzzled by the intensity of his gaze. He managed a small smile, though his mind was racing. "I apologize, Emily. It's just that pendant. It reminded me of someone I knew a long time ago." Emily seemed to accept his explanation, though she still looked intrigued. Well, it's nice to have a connection to the past, I suppose. I've always felt that way about this little charm. I don't know who gave it to me, but it feels important. They spent the next few minutes discussing the final details of the car, but Caleb was only half listening. His mind was consumed with the possibility that his daughter might be standing right in front of him, unaware of the connection they shared. He didn't know what his next step should be, but he was certain of one thing. He couldn't let this go. As they wrapped up, Emily gave him her business card. "Feel free to reach out if you have any questions, Mr. Prescott. It was a pleasure assisting you today." Caleb took the card, his fingers brushing hers briefly. "Thank you, Emily. I'll be in touch." He left the dealership feeling dazed, a mixture of hope and dread filling his chest. As he got back into the car, he glanced back at the dealership through the window, watching Emily's figure as she walked back inside. Could it really be her? The seed of possibility took root in his mind. Growing with each passing second, he knew he'd be returning to that dealership, and he wouldn't stop until he found out the truth. The drive back to his office was a blur. Caleb's thoughts were spinning, his mind racing with every possible scenario. He had learned to keep his emotions in check over the years. But now, the rigid control he'd perfected was slipping. The sight of that pendant, the way Emily had spoken about her past, it was too much to ignore. Once he reached his office, Caleb immediately shut the door and took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He was accustomed to dealing with high-stakes decisions. But this was different. This was personal. He knew he couldn't let this go until he had real answers. Caleb reached for his phone, quickly dialing the number of a private investigator he had worked with on various occasions over the years. "Doug, it's Caleb. I need a background check done immediately." "Of course. Mr. Prescott," Doug's voice replied, his tone as professional as always. "What's the name?" "Her name is Emily," Caleb said, pausing as he realized he didn't know her last name. He cursed himself silently for not asking her directly. "She works at the Hanover Luxury Auto Dealership in Austin. Find out everything you can about her. Family, background, adoption records, anything." Doug didn't hesitate. "I'll get started on it right away. You'll have everything I can find by the end of the week." "Thank you," Caleb replied, ending the call. He knew Doug would handle the task with the utmost discretion, but he was still anxious. Waiting days for answers seemed unbearable, especially now that he was so close to the possibility of reuniting with Lillian. As he sat at his desk, he found himself replaying the encounter with Emily over and over in his mind. The way she had spoken about her adoption, her faint memory of being called Lily. Could it really be a coincidence? Or was he finally on the verge of finding his daughter? The next day, Caleb found himself heading back to the dealership under the pretense of having additional questions about the car he'd bought for Meredith. It was an excuse, of course, but he needed to see Emily again, to watch her, to confirm the gut feeling he couldn't ignore. When he arrived, she greeted him with the same warm smile, seeming genuinely pleased to see him. "Mr. Prescott back so soon?" Caleb offered a small smile, trying to keep his emotions in check. "Yes. I had a few more questions about the car's features, and, well, you seemed so knowledgeable. I figured you'd be the best person to help me." Emily laughed softly. "Well, I'm glad to help. What questions do you have?" As they walked through the showroom, Caleb did his best to keep the conversation casual, asking questions about safety features and fuel efficiency. Even though he hardly cared about the answers, what he really wanted was to learn more about her life, her experiences, any small detail that might give him more insight into who she was. "Emily," he said after a while, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but have you ever considered looking into your birth family?" She seemed surprised by the question, glancing at him with a thoughtful expression. "Honestly, I've thought about it a few times over the years, but I don't know where I'd even begin. My adoptive parents didn't know much about my background, and I don't have many clues to go on." "What about that pendant?" Caleb asked, struggling to keep his tone neutral. "It seems special." Emily's hand moved instinctively to her necklace, her fingers tracing the delicate shape of the pendant. "Yes, it is special to me. It's funny. I can't remember much from my life before, but this feels like it connects me to something, or someone. It's hard to explain." Caleb nodded, fighting to keep the surge of emotions in check. "It's not so strange," he murmured. "Sometimes an object can hold memories we're not even aware of. Maybe there's more to it than you realize. She looked at him curiously, and Caleb felt the intensity of her gaze, as if she were trying to understand why he cared so much. He could see a flicker of curiosity in her eyes, but she didn't press further. After they wrapped up their conversation about the car, Caleb thanked her, feeling torn. He wanted to tell her everything, to see if she remembered anything more about her past, but he knew he had to be cautious. Rushing this would only risk pushing her away. Later that evening, Caleb returned home, but his mind was far from at ease. As he sat in his study, he found himself searching through old files and records, reviewing everything he knew about Lillian's disappearance. He hadn't looked through these documents in years, but now, with Emily's face fresh in his mind, he couldn't resist. He pored over the police reports. The last photographs they had taken of Lillian, the descriptions of her at age 7. It was haunting how many similarities he noticed between his memories of Lillian and the woman he had met. They shared the same expressive eyes, the same smile that lit up a room, and of course there was the pendant. There was. Just as he was lost in thought, his phone buzzed with a message from Doug. Caleb opened it eagerly, scanning the brief update. Doug had managed to confirm a few details. Emily had indeed been adopted at the age of 7, though her original birth records were sealed. Caleb's heart pounded at the implications, his suspicion growing stronger. Could it really be her? He whispered to himself, feeling a mixture of hope and fear. He wasn't ready to let himself believe it, not yet, but he knew he couldn't stop now. He was closer than ever to finding the truth, and he was willing to do whatever it took to uncover it. Over the next few days, Caleb made it a habit to visit the dealership, creating excuses to talk to Emily. He learned small details about her life, how she loved reading mystery novels, her favorite coffee order, the way she lit up when talking about her close friends. Every interaction only deepened his conviction that she was, indeed, his daughter, but he also began to sense her unease, noticing the occasional glances she gave him, as if questioning why he was so interested in her. Caleb knew he had to tread carefully. Emily was beginning to grow suspicious, and he couldn't risk scaring her away as the days passed. Caleb's determination intensified, but so did his anxiety. He was walking a delicate line, balancing his desire for the truth with the need to protect Emily's trust. And as he waited for Doug to uncover more information, he realized he was also preparing himself for what might come next, for the moment when he would finally confront her with the truth he believed to be real. Caleb's routine visits to the dealership were becoming more frequent, and with each encounter, his confidence that Emily was, in fact, his daughter grew stronger. The familiar way she spoke, the subtle gestures she made, and the sparkle in her eyes when she was excited, all stirred memories of Lillian as a little girl. But even as his conviction grew, so did his caution. He knew he couldn't risk overwhelming her. Every step had to be careful, measured. Emily, for her part, had noticed his unusual interest. At first, she'd brushed it off as nothing more than a friendly rapport between a client and a salesperson. But as the days passed and Caleb continued to return, she couldn't ignore the strange feeling of familiarity that seemed to linger whenever he was around. She found herself looking forward to his visits, curious about the man who seemed both reserved and unexpectedly warm. One afternoon, Caleb walked into the dealership once again, feeling a sense of determination that was growing stronger with each day. He wanted to know more about Emily's life, her childhood, her memories, anything that might provide him with clues to confirm what his heart already suspected. He found her at the front desk, deep in conversation with a coworker, her laughter echoing through the showroom. When she noticed him, she smiled warmly. "Mr. Prescott, you're becoming quite the regular around here," she teased, her tone light. Caleb returned her smile, though he felt the usual pang in his chest at the sight of her. "I suppose I am," he admitted. "I just seem to keep finding reasons to come back." Emily's smile softened, and she gestured for him to follow her toward a quieter corner of the showroom. "Well, what can I help you with today?" Caleb hesitated, searching for the right words. "Actually, I was hoping you might humor an old man for a little longer," he said, trying to sound casual. "I realized I know so little about you, and you've been so helpful to me. I'd love to know a bit more about the person behind that professionalism." She raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "You want to know about me?" "Just some basics," he replied with a slight smile. Where you grew up, what you like to do outside of work. Emily tilted her head, studying him with a curious expression. Well, there's not much to tell, she said after a moment, shrugging. I grew up here in Texas mostly. I was adopted when I was 7 and spent most of my life in Austin. It was a pretty simple childhood, really. Do you ever wonder about your life before then? Caleb asked, his voice gentle. She paused, her fingers instinctively touching the pendant around her neck. Sometimes, she admitted. I remember bits and pieces, but it's all a bit hazy, I think. I think I had another name back then. Lily, maybe. She laughed softly, though it was a bit nervous. But it's strange. I don't remember much else. Just that name and this pendant. Caleb's heart skipped a beat. He could feel his pulse racing, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He wanted so badly to tell her the truth, to reveal everything he'd kept hidden. But he held himself back, his resolve steadying him. Lily, he repeated quietly, letting the name linger. It's a beautiful name. Thank you, she replied, her smile fading slightly as her eyes took on a thoughtful expression. Sometimes, I wonder if I'll ever find out what happened, why I ended up where I did. My adoptive parents were wonderful, but I suppose everyone has questions. Right, Caleb nodded, choosing his next words carefully. Everyone does, yes. And sometimes the past can surprise you in ways you'd never expect. Emily glanced at him, her curiosity piqued. What about you, Mr. Prescott? Do you have any mysteries in your past? Caleb chuckled, though there was a sadness behind it. More than I'd care to admit, he said, his gaze drifting to the pendant once again. Life has a way of keeping things hidden until just the right moment. She looked at him, studying his face with a quiet intensity that seemed almost too perceptive. For a brief moment, Caleb felt as if she might be able to see through his carefully constructed facade. But then she smiled, her lightheartedness returning. Well, I think everyone has their own story. Maybe some mysteries are better left as they are, she said, though there was a hint of wistfulness in her voice. Caleb nodded, feeling a pang of regret. Perhaps, but sometimes the answers we seek have a way of finding us. The conversation shifted to lighter topics as they talked about their favorite books. Places in Austin and other small details. Caleb found himself relaxing, enjoying the simplicity of their exchange. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of calm, a momentary reprieve from the pain he'd carried for so long. It was as if, in her presence, the weight of his loss was slightly lessened. But even in the warmth of their conversation, a tension lingered. Caleb knew he was keeping something monumental from her, a truth that could change everything. He wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap between them, but he was held back by the fear of her reaction. What if she rejected him? What if she wanted nothing to do with the man who'd lost her once? Their conversation was interrupted by a customer needing Emily's assistance, and she excused herself with an apologetic smile. It was great chatting with you, Mr. Prescott. Feel free to stop by any time. I think the staff here are starting to consider you part of the dealership family. Caleb chuckled, though his heart was heavy. Thank you, Emily. I may take you up on that. As she walked away, he watched her with a mixture of pride and sadness. She had grown into a remarkable young woman, intelligent, kind, and resilient. The thought that he had missed watching her grow up filled him with a sense of loss that words could never capture. Back at his office later that day, Caleb sat alone, the quietness of his surroundings amplifying his thoughts. His investigator had updated him that Emily's records were difficult to access, with parts of her background sealed due to her adoption. But the little information Doug had uncovered continued to point to the possibility that she was indeed his daughter. The pendulum of hope and fear swung back and forth, each day drawing him closer to an inevitable revelation. He couldn't keep hiding behind small talk and idle conversation. Soon, he would need to tell her the truth, but for now, he would hold on to these fragile moments, these tentative bonds they were building. Caleb realized that for the first time in years, he felt something close to happiness, a glimmer of possibility that the family he had lost might, against all odds, still be within reach. The weight of Caleb's suspicions grew heavier each day. He knew he couldn't keep this hidden forever sooner or later. He would have to face the truth and confront the past. After nearly 2 weeks of visits, small talk, and subtle inquiries, he was running out of reasons to delay. His investigators' updates had been scarce, But each new piece of information only added fuel to the fire of his conviction one evening. Caleb sat alone in his study, staring at the scattered documents on his desk. He had reviewed every report, every old photo, and every detail he had gathered over the years. The fragmented pieces of Lillian's life and disappearance were all there. And now, with Emily in the picture, they seemed to connect in ways he could never have imagined. There was only one part of the puzzle that remained elusive: Russell Barrett. Russell had been Caleb's rival in the business world for decades. A man as ruthless and cunning as Caleb was respected. Their feud had begun as a competitive rivalry, but it quickly escalated into something personal, bitter, and far-reaching. Caleb had suspected that Russell had played a role in Lillian's disappearance, but he had never been able to prove it. He had always known Russell was capable of anything, yet he'd hoped his suspicions were wrong. But the more he thought about it, the more convinced Caleb became that Russell had taken Lillian as part of his twisted plan for revenge. The timing, the secrecy, the sealed adoption records, all of it pointed back to Russell. His instincts told him that Russell was the key to unlocking this mystery, and he knew what he had to do. The next morning, Caleb made a decision he had avoided for nearly 2 decades. He would confront Russell. He called his assistant to arrange a meeting, and within hours, found himself driving to the Barrett estate, a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of Austin. As he approached, he could feel the tension in his chest tightening, the years of animosity between them flaring up once more. This time, though, it wasn't about business or wealth. It was about his daughter. When he arrived, a servant escorted him into a grand sitting room, where Russell was already waiting, sipping a glass of whiskey with a smug smile. "Caleb Prescott," Russell greeted him, his voice dripping with a mock cordiality that only served to irritate Caleb further. "To what do I owe the pleasure? I didn't expect a social call from you." Caleb clenched his jaw, fighting to keep his emotions in check. "I'm not here for pleasantries, Russell. I'm here for answers." Russell raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Answers about what, exactly?" Caleb took a step closer, his eyes fixed on his rival. "You know exactly what I'm talking about, Lillian, my daughter. You know what happened to her, don't you?" Russell's smile faded slightly, though his eyes still glinted with amusement. "Oh, Caleb, it's been so long. Surely you aren't still chasing that ghost." Caleb's fists clenched. "I know you were involved. I know you had something to do with her disappearance. 18 years, Russell. 18 years of torment, of wondering if she was out there, alone, scared. And now, I think I've found her." Russell leaned back in his chair, his face impassive, though there was a hint of a smirk at the corners of his mouth. "Found her, you say? And you think I had something to do with her unfortunate vanishing act?" Caleb's patience snapped. "Enough games, Russell. Just tell me the truth. Did you take her?" For a moment, there was silence between them, a tense standoff filled with unspoken threats and decades of bitterness. Finally, Russell chuckled softly, setting his glass down on the table with a clink. He leaned forward, his voice lowering to a cold whisper. "Yes, Caleb, I took her." The words hit Caleb like a punch to the gut. He felt the blood drain from his face, his hands shaking as he struggled to process the confirmation of his worst fears. Russell continued, his tone calm, almost casual. "You were so certain that your life was untouchable, that your perfect little family was beyond my reach. So I decided to teach you a lesson. I took your daughter and gave her a new life, a new name, a new father." Caleb's hands balled into fists, rage simmering beneath the surface. "You stole my child to satisfy your own ego." Russell's expression darkened, and his voice grew harsher. "You took everything from me, Caleb. Everything I built, every opportunity I earned. You found a way to take it for yourself, so I thought it only fitting to take something from you." Caleb felt sick, his mind racing with the implications of what Russell had done. "And Emily, she's Lillian, isn't she? You raised her, lied to her, taught her to hate me." Russell's smirk returned, his eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction. "Yes, she doesn't know who you are. She thinks you're the enemy. Isn't it poetic? Caleb, the very daughter you've searched for all these years has been right under your nose, despising you, working against you." Caleb's rage bubbled over, and he felt an intense urge to lash out, to make Russell pay for every ounce of pain he had caused. but he forced himself to stay calm, knowing that losing control now would only play into Russell's hands. "You're a monster," Caleb spat, his voice low and filled with contempt. "You'll never get away with this." Russell laughed, leaning back in his chair. "I already have, Caleb. You can tell her the truth if you want. But do you think she'll believe you, after everything I've taught her? Everything she's grown up believing? She sees me as her father. You're just a stranger with a sad story." Caleb's heart twisted at the truth in Russell's words. He had dreamed of reuniting with Lillian for so long, but he had never anticipated that she might see him as the villain. The revelation was a blow, but he knew he couldn't give up. He had found her, and now he had to find a way to make her see the truth. With one final glare, Caleb turned and left, not trusting himself to remain in Russell's presence any longer. The drive back to his office was filled with an oppressive silence, the weight of Russell's confession pressing down on him like a lead blanket. As he pulled into the parking garage, he sat in his car for a few moments, his mind racing. He knew he had to be careful about how he approached Emily. If Russell had spent years manipulating her, convincing her to distrust him, then any sudden revelation could backfire. But one thing was clear: he couldn't let Russell's twisted game continue. Emily deserved to know the truth, and he would do whatever it took to make her see it. Steeling himself, Caleb took a deep breath. He had faced down ruthless business opponents, navigated complex negotiations, and built an empire from the ground up. But this challenge, reconnecting with his daughter and breaking through years of lies, felt like the most daunting task he had ever faced. For now, he would bide his time, gather the proof he needed, and wait for the right moment. But he knew, with every fiber of his being, that he would stop at nothing to bring Emily back into his life, and to finally, after 18 long years, make things right. The weight of Russell's confession gnawed at Caleb, filling him with a mix of rage and desperation. For so long, he had clung to the hope that he might one day find Lillian, that he could reunite with his daughter and heal the wounds of the past. But now, knowing she had been raised under Russell's manipulative influence, his hope was tangled with an undeniable fear that she might never accept him as her father. Caleb knew he had to tread carefully. Russell had crafted a web of lies around Emily, conditioning her to see Caleb as a threat, a stranger, and though Caleb wanted nothing more than to tell her the truth, he knew that rushing would likely push her further away. The bond he longed for was fragile, delicate, and he had to protect it. That evening, Caleb called Doug, his investigator, instructing him to dig deeper into Russell's connections to Emily's adoption. He needed proof, something concrete that could bridge the gap between them. As he paced his study, his mind was already racing with a plan. Slowly, carefully, he would unravel the lies that had kept them apart. The following day, Caleb returned to the dealership, his resolve tempered by patience. He walked through the glass doors, taking a steadying breath. Emily was assisting another client, so he waited near the showroom, watching her from a distance. It amazed him how much she resembled the little girl he remembered. Though older, her mannerisms, her expressions, and even the way she listened intently to others mirrored Lillian's gentle nature. When Emily noticed him, she offered him a bright smile and excused herself from her client, walking over with her usual warmth. "Back again, Mr. Prescott," she teased. "I have to admit, I'm starting to think you're not here just for the cars." Caleb smiled, though it was tinged with melancholy. "You might be right," he replied, his voice soft. She gave him a curious look. "Is everything all right?" He nodded, though his gaze drifted to the pendant resting against her collarbone, the very reminder of his lost years with her. "Emily," he began, choosing his words carefully, "have you ever thought about your past? I know we spoke about it before, but do you ever wonder about the life you might have had?" Emily paused, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes, yes. I love my adoptive family. They were wonderful to me, but..." Her voice trailed off, and she touched the pendant gently, her fingers tracing its edges. "There are moments when I feel like there's a whole world of memories that I can't reach, like pieces of a story I don't know." Caleb swallowed, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Maybe those pieces are closer than you think." Emily looked at him, her expression shifting from curiosity to something more guarded. "What do you mean?" He said slowly, "that sometimes, The answers we've been looking for are closer than we realize. They're just waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves." She looked away, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "I don't know, Mr. Prescott, it's comforting to think that, but I've lived with these questions for so long. I guess I've learned not to expect much in the way of answers." Caleb felt a pang of regret, knowing that he was skirting around the truth, but he couldn't rush this. "I understand," he said gently, "but maybe it wouldn't hurt to ask a few questions." Emily offered a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I'll think about it." They fell into a brief silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Caleb wanted so desperately to bridge the gap between them, to show her the truth of who he was and how much he had longed for her, but he also knew that revealing everything too soon could shatter whatever trust they were beginning to build. Later that evening, Caleb returned home to find a message from Doug. The investigator had managed to uncover more records, confirming that Emily's adoption had indeed been handled through private channels associated with Russell's connections. Caleb felt both relief and anger. He now had the proof he needed to show Emily the truth, but it also confirmed the lengths Russell had gone to in order to manipulate and deceive. Caleb stared at the document on his screen, his heart racing. This was it, the connection he needed, but he still had to be cautious. He needed to show Emily the truth without scaring her away, to make her see that he was the father she'd been separated from, the one who had never stopped searching. The next day, Caleb returned to the dealership with a renewed determination. He'd asked Emily if they could talk over lunch, and to his relief, she had agreed. They met at a small, quiet cafe near her work, where Caleb hoped the informal setting would help ease the tension he knew might arise as they sat down. Caleb felt the weight of the document in his jacket pocket, knowing that he held in his hands the key to revealing the truth, but he had to proceed gently. "Emily," he began, his voice soft yet steady, "I wanted to thank you for taking the time to meet me. I know my visits have been frequent, and I apologize if I've made you uncomfortable." She smiled, looking slightly amused. "It's okay, Mr. Prescott. I have to admit, I was curious about why you kept coming back." He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Emily, there's something I need to tell you. Something important." She tilted her head, her expression shifting to one of cautious interest. "What is it?" Caleb hesitated, his heart pounding. 18 years ago, I lost someone very dear to me, my daughter Lillian. She disappeared when she was 7. I spent years searching for her, following every lead, every rumor, and when I met you, I felt something I couldn't ignore. Emily's face paled, and her fingers instinctively reached for her pendant. "Mr. Prescott, I don't understand." He reached into his jacket, pulling out the document, but he placed it on the table without sliding it toward her. "I think you might be Lillian, Emily. My daughter." The silence between them was palpable, and Emily's eyes widened in shock. She looked down at the document, then back at him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and fear. That can't be. I don't remember anything like that." Caleb's voice was barely above a whisper. "I know it's a lot to take in, and I know you don't remember, but this document, it confirms that your adoption was arranged by someone connected to my family's history." Emily stared at him, her hands trembling slightly as she processed his words. "But if what you're saying is true, why wouldn't I remember?" Caleb took a deep breath, steadying himself. I believe that you were taken by someone who wanted to hurt me, and they might have influenced you, made you forget. I know it sounds unbelievable, but I have every reason to think that Russell Barrett was involved." Emily's expression hardened, and she shook her head. "Russell Barrett? No, that's impossible. He's been like a father to me." Caleb's heart sank at her words, but he pressed on gently. "Emily, please, just take some time to think about it. Maybe there are things you don't remember, things that were hidden from you." She pushed the document away, her face conflicted and tearful. I don't know what to believe." Caleb reached across the table, his voice filled with a quiet plea. "I'm not asking you to believe everything right now. I'm just asking you to consider it. And if you're willing, I can help you piece together the past." Emily looked away, tears welling up in her eyes as the weight of his revelation settled over her. I need some time." Caleb nodded, his own heart breaking at the pain in her eyes. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here whenever you're ready," as she left the cafe. Caleb felt both relief and sorrow. He had finally taken the first step in telling her the truth, but he knew there was still a long journey ahead. And as he watched her walk away, he could only hope that, in time, she would come to understand the love and pain that had driven him to search for her all these years. Emily spent the next few days in a whirlwind of confusion, her mind struggling to process the revelations Caleb had shared with her, the possibility that her life had been built on lies, that Russell had manipulated her, and that Caleb might actually be her real father left her feeling untethered, as if the ground beneath her had shifted in ways she couldn't control. She had always trusted Russell. He had been there for her since she was a little girl, guiding her, caring for her in his own stern way. He was the only father she had ever known. The thought that he might have been responsible for tearing her away from her biological family was too painful to accept. On a particularly quiet afternoon at the dealership, she found herself alone in the break room, staring blankly at her reflection in the window. Her hand moved to her pendant, and she held it tightly, as if it might somehow offer her answers. Memories she had buried long ago surfaced in fragments. A blurry face, a warm voice calling her Lily, the feeling of being cherished and safe. But just as quickly as they appeared, the memories faded, leaving her feeling empty and unsure. Her coworker Sarah walked in, snapping her out of her thoughts. "Hey Emily, are you okay? You've seemed distracted lately?" Emily forced a smile, though it felt hollow. "Yeah, just a lot on my mind." Sarah tilted her head, clearly concerned. "Anything you want to talk about?" Emily hesitated, unsure if she could even begin to explain the turmoil inside her. "I'm not sure you'd believe me if I told you." Sarah chuckled softly. "Try me. I'm here if you need to vent." Emily sighed, the weight of her thoughts too much to keep to herself any longer. What if you found out that someone you've trusted your whole life, someone who's been like family, might not be who you thought they were? Sarah's brow furrowed. "Are you talking about family?" "Something like that," Emily replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She glanced down at the pendant again, feeling the familiar pang of uncertainty. I don't know what to believe anymore." "Well, I think you have to follow your gut," Sarah said gently. "Trust is hard to rebuild once it's broken, but sometimes facing the truth is the only way to find peace." Emily nodded. Though she wasn't sure what her gut was telling her, she felt torn between the man who had raised her and the man who claimed to be her father, the kindness Caleb had shown her, the gentle way he'd tried to reveal the truth. It all conflicted with the bitter image of him that Russell had painted over the years. That evening, Emily sat in her small apartment, the silence pressing down on her. She thought about Caleb's words, his steady gaze as he revealed the truth he believed with such conviction. Her heart told her there was something genuine in him, something that had touched a part of her she hadn't known existed. And yet, her loyalty to Russell weighed heavily on her. Finally, she made a decision. She needed to confront Russell. The next day, she drove to Russell's estate, feeling a strange mixture of dread and determination. When she arrived, Russell welcomed her with his usual warmth, though she noticed a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He didn't seem used to her visiting him unannounced. "Emily, to what do I owe this visit?" he asked, his voice as smooth and practiced as always. Emily hesitated, gathering her thoughts. "Russell, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Russell's expression softened, though his eyes grew sharper, as if he sensed the seriousness in her tone. "Of course, Emily. You know you can ask me anything." She took a deep breath, the words catching in her throat. I met someone recently, Caleb Prescott. He says he's my father." Russell's face darkened, his smile fading instantly. "Caleb Prescott." He shook his head, his expression hardening. "That man has caused nothing but trouble. Whatever he told you, Emily, you can't trust him." "But he had records," she pressed, her voice wavering. "He showed me documents, things that point to my adoption being arranged through your connections." Russell's gaze turned icy, and Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. "Emily, listen to me. Caleb Prescott is a dangerous man. He's tried to ruin me for years, and now he's trying to turn you against me. Do you think he would hesitate to lie to get what he wants?" Emily looked away, feeling the weight of his words. though a part of her couldn't shake the doubt growing in her heart. "I don't know, Russell. He seemed genuine. He told me things that felt real." Russell's jaw tightened, and his voice dropped to a harsh whisper. "Emily, you're like a daughter to me. I've taken care of you, given you everything you could ever need. Don't let that man manipulate you into thinking he cares about you. He's only after revenge." Her eyes filled with tears as the conflict within her grew. She had loved Russell like a father, trusted him with her life, and yet, Caleb's presence had awakened something in her, something that felt deeply, painfully true. I don't know what to believe," she whispered, her voice cracking. Russell's expression softened, and he reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Emily, you don't have to doubt me. I've always had your best interests at heart. Trust me, and stay away from that man. He will only hurt you." Emily nodded slowly, though the turmoil inside her remained. She wanted so desperately to believe him, to cling to the familiar safety he had always provided. But a part of her couldn't ignore the growing sense that there was more to the story, that Caleb's words had struck a nerve buried deep within her. When she left Russell's estate, her mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. The doubt Caleb had planted in her heart was now a tangled web of memories, questions, and fears. She spent the following days in a haze, unable to focus on anything, her thoughts constantly drifting back to Caleb's face, his words, and the pendant around her neck. Finally, one evening, she reached for her phone and sent him a message. "Mr. Prescott, if you're free, I'd like to talk." Within moments, Caleb replied, and they agreed to meet the next day at a small park outside of the city. Emily arrived early, her heart pounding with anxiety and anticipation. When she saw Caleb approaching, she felt a strange mixture of relief and tension. As if she were on the edge of something monumental, they sat together on a bench under the shade of a large oak tree, the air thick with unspoken words. "Thank you for meeting me," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb nodded, his gaze steady and warm. "Of course, Emily. I'll always make time for you." She took a deep breath, her fingers fiddling with the pendant around her neck. I went to see Russell. I asked him about everything you told me." Caleb's expression tightened, but he waited silently, giving her the space to continue. "He told me not to trust you," she said, her voice trembling. He said you're just trying to hurt me, to use me as some kind of revenge against him." Caleb closed his eyes briefly, a look of pain crossing his face. When he opened them, he spoke softly, his voice filled with sincerity. "Emily, I know it's hard. I know you've been told things that make it difficult to believe me, but I swear to you, I would never hurt you. All I've ever wanted is to protect you." She looked away, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I don't know what to believe. Everything feels so broken." Caleb reached out, gently placing his hand over hers. "I understand, and I'm not asking you to choose. I just want you to know that no matter what, I'm here for you, whether you accept me as your father or not. I care about you, Emily. That will never change." They sat in silence, her hand in his, the bond between them both fragile and profound. For the first time, Emily felt the possibility that Caleb's words could be true, that maybe, just maybe, she had finally found the father she had always longed for. Emily felt the weight of Caleb's words long after their meeting. She had expected him to insist, to push her to accept his version of the truth, but instead, he had been patient, calm, and kind. The gentleness in his eyes as he'd said he would always be there for her had left her shaken. It was a look she'd never seen in Russell's eyes, a look that seemed to reach straight into her soul. That night, lying awake in her small apartment, Emily found herself sifting through old memories, small flashes that had always seemed insignificant, but now felt like pieces of a bigger puzzle. She remembered moments, faint, fleeting images of a home, of someone calling her Lily, and of being held close and safe. These memories felt different, somehow warmer, more comforting than the memories she had of her childhood with Russell. And as she replayed Caleb's words, she felt an urge growing inside her, a longing to understand the truth that she had tried to ignore for so long. The next day, she decided to reach out to Caleb again. "Would you be willing to meet with me?" she texted him, her heart pounding as she awaited his reply. Within minutes, her phone buzzed. "Of course, Emily. Name the time and place, and I'll be there." They agreed to meet at a quiet cafe not far from her apartment, a place where they could talk without interruptions. Emily arrived early, feeling a mix of nervousness and excitement. When Caleb walked in, his face softened with a warmth that made her chest tighten, and she realized just how much she wanted to believe him. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice shaky as he took a seat across from her. "Thank you for inviting me," he replied gently. "I'm just glad we can talk." They ordered coffee, and for a moment, an awkward silence settled between them. Finally, Emily broke it, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to think, Caleb. I've spent my whole life believing Russell was, well, that he was my father, in a way. But since you told me everything, I've started remembering little things, moments that don't make sense with the life I thought I had." Caleb nodded, his gaze filled with understanding. "It makes sense that you would be confused. Memories can be powerful, especially when they're tied to feelings we can't explain. Sometimes they're buried deep, but they find ways to resurface." She looked down, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "Do you really believe that I'm Lillian?" Caleb reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, well-worn photograph. He slid it across the table, his hand trembling slightly. "This was taken a few days before you disappeared." Emily took the photograph, her breath catching as she looked at the image of a little girl with wide eyes and a bright smile, clutching a heart-shaped pendant. The same pendant she wore now, her eyes filled with tears as she studied the picture, her heart pounding as the realization started to sink in. "I look just like her," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Caleb's hand reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. "You don't just look like her, Emily. I believe, with everything in me, that you are her." Tears blurred her vision as she looked up at him, a question lingering on her lips. But why? Why would Russell do something like this? Caleb's face darkened, and he took a deep breath, his gaze steady as he tried to explain. "Russell and I have a complicated history. It started with business, but it became personal. When I started uncovering his unethical practices, he felt threatened, and he wanted to hurt me in the worst way possible. Taking you was his way of getting revenge." Emily's hands shook as she processed his words. She had always respected Russell, had trusted him as a father figure. The thought that he might have stolen her away, that he had shaped her life out of vengeance, made her feel sick. "But he raised me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He took care of me, didn't he?" Caleb's eyes filled with sorrow, and he spoke softly, gently. "I know that this is hard to hear, and I know that part of you might still care for him, but I also believe that he manipulated you. Emily, he raised you to see him as your protector, your only family, but he kept you from knowing who you truly are." She looked away, struggling with the pain and betrayal that his words stirred within her. I feel like my whole life has been a lie." Caleb reached across the table, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "Your life isn't a lie, Emily. You are still the person you've always been. But now, you have the chance to understand where you came from, to reclaim the pieces of yourself that were taken." She held his gaze, feeling the strength and sincerity in his words. Part of her wanted to pull away, to return to the life she'd always known, where things were simpler, safer. But another part of her, a part she could no longer ignore, felt drawn to Caleb, to the connection they shared, even if it was shrouded in years of pain and separation. They spent the next hour talking about the small details of her early childhood, memories that Caleb shared and that Emily found herself connecting with. She learned about her mother, a warm and loving woman who had passed away shortly after Lillian's birth. She heard stories of the little things that had once brought her joy, her love for music, her fascination with the stars, her habit of twirling a strand of hair around her finger when she was nervous. Each memory Caleb recounted felt like a missing piece, filling the empty spaces in her heart. When they finally left the cafe, Emily felt both overwhelmed and strangely peaceful. She still had 1,000 questions, a mountain of doubts, but for the first time, she felt like she was beginning to understand the truth. As they walked toward her car, Caleb hesitated, his face filled with emotion. "Emily," he said softly, "I know that this is a lot to take in, and I don't expect you to have all the answers right away. But whatever happens, I want you to know that I'm here for you. I'm not going anywhere." She looked up at him, a lump forming in her throat. "Thank you, Caleb. I still don't know what to believe, but I'm willing to try." A faint smile crossed his face, and he nodded. "That's all I can ask for." They parted ways, each of them carrying the weight of their shared history and the tentative hope for a future they were only beginning to glimpse. That night, Emily returned to her apartment, her mind racing with everything Caleb had shared. She sat by her window, staring up at the stars, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. It was as if, for the first time, she was beginning to see herself clearly, to understand the girl she had once been and the woman she was becoming. As she held the pendant in her hand, she made a silent promise to herself. She would pursue the truth. No matter where it led, she would uncover the life that had been stolen from her, and she would face whatever pain or uncertainty came her way. Because for the first time in her life, she felt like she had something real, a connection. A father who had never stopped searching for her. The next morning, she awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. There were still so many unanswered questions, so much she needed to understand, but with Caleb's unwavering support, she felt ready to face the path ahead, whatever it might hold. Emily had spent days replaying every moment she'd shared with Caleb, every revelation, every piece of her past that he had helped bring to light. She felt a sense of clarity she hadn't known before, as if the fog of uncertainty was finally beginning to lift. Yet, she knew that to move forward, she needed to confront the man who had raised her, the man she had once considered her only family. Determined, Emily decided to investigate further. She started with small, cautious steps, searching through documents and files she found at home, piecing together fragments of her childhood with new eyes. Some details of her past seemed innocuous at first, but in light of Caleb's story, they began to take on new meaning. There were gaps in her adoption records, peculiarities in her school transfer papers, and times when she remembered being told conflicting stories about her early years. It was late one evening when she finally gathered the courage to return to Russell's estate. She had wrestled with the decision, knowing it would be difficult, but also understanding that she couldn't move forward without hearing his side. If there was any truth to Caleb's words, then Russell owed her an explanation. As she arrived, Russell greeted her warmly, his usual air of confidence tempered by a slight tension in his eyes. Emily felt a flicker of doubt, but she pushed it aside, determined to get to the bottom of her past. "Emily, this is a surprise," Russell said, his voice smooth but guarded. "I wasn't expecting you." She took a steadying breath, her voice firm. "Russell, I need you to be honest with me. About everything." He frowned slightly, though he quickly masked it with a gentle smile. "Of course, Emily. You know you can ask me anything." She met his gaze, trying to remain calm. "I want to know about my adoption, why there are so many inconsistencies, and I need you to tell me the truth about Caleb Prescott." At the mention of Caleb's name, Russell's expression darkened, and his smile faded. "Emily, I've told you before, Caleb Prescott is not to be trusted. He's a man who would do anything to destroy me, even if it meant using you as a pawn." "Using me," she echoed, her voice trembling. "Russell, he showed me pictures, documents. He told me things about my childhood that I can't ignore. Why do I have memories that don't match up with what you told me?" Russell's jaw tightened, his tone hardening. "Emily, listen to me. Caleb Prescott is manipulating you. He's planting false memories, trying to turn you against me. He's a man filled with hatred and bitterness, and he'll do anything to ruin me, even if it means confusing you." Emily shook her head, feeling a wave of frustration. "That's not good enough, Russell. I need real answers. Were you involved in my adoption? Did you take me from him?" For a moment, Russell was silent, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. Finally, he sighed, a cold smile creeping across his face. "Very well, Emily. You want the truth? Fine. Yes. I arranged your adoption. I took you in, gave you a life that Caleb Prescott could never have offered you. He didn't deserve you." The words sent a chill down her spine, and she took a step back, her heart racing. You stole me from him." Russell's face was unrepentant, his expression cold and unyielding. "I did what needed to be done. Caleb Prescott was a threat to my success, a man who stood in my way, Taking you from him was justice, and I raised you better than he ever could have." Emily felt the room spinning as his words sank in. All these years she had trusted him, relied on him, believed he had her best interests at heart, and yet he had orchestrated her life to fulfill his own twisted vendetta. "Do you even realize what you did to me?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "You kept me from my family. You made me believe that you were my only father, and all along it was just revenge." Russell's eyes softened slightly, though his voice remained firm. "Emily, I gave you everything. Everything. A life of privilege, security, and comfort. I protected you, cared for you as my own. Can't you see that this is where you belong?" But Emily shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "No, Russell, you didn't protect me. You controlled me. You used me to hurt someone else. And in the process, you hurt me too." Russell took a step toward her, his voice lowering. "Emily, you don't understand. Caleb is not the man you think he is. He will abandon you, just as he abandoned everything else he cared about." But Emily saw through his words now, saw the manipulation for what it was. "I don't believe you," she said quietly, her voice steady. "I don't know if I'll ever believe you again." Without another word, she turned and walked out of his estate, leaving Russell standing alone in the silence. The finality of it weighed on her as she stepped into the cool night air, but she felt a strange sense of relief, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders. She had finally confronted the truth, and there was no going back. That evening, she called Caleb. "Emily," he answered, his voice filled with concern. "Caleb," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "you were right. About everything, Russell. He admitted it. He took me. He kept me from you. All these years." She heard Caleb's sharp intake of breath, the pain evident in his silence. "I'm so sorry, Emily. I can't imagine what you're feeling right now. I don't know what to do," she whispered, feeling the weight of the years and lies pressing down on her. "It's like my whole life is falling apart." Caleb's voice was gentle, steady. "You don't have to face this alone. I'm here, Emily. Whatever you need, whatever you want to know, I'll be here to help you." The kindness in his voice brought fresh tears to her eyes. "Thank you, Caleb. I want to get to know you. The real you, not the version Russell tried to make me believe." Caleb's voice was filled with emotion. "I would be honored, Emily, truly." Over the next few days, they began meeting regularly. Caleb shared stories of her early childhood, moments they had shared before she was taken from him. They went through old photos together, Caleb carefully recounting each memory, his voice tender as he spoke of the love he had always felt for her. Emily began to see glimpses of the life she had lost, a life filled with warmth and joy, a life that had been stolen from her. For the first time, she began to feel a sense of belonging that was different from anything she had known with Russell. It was a love that wasn't tied to manipulation or control, but rather to a genuine connection she was finally rediscovering. One evening, as they walked through a nearby park, Caleb turned to her, his face filled with hope and vulnerability. "Emily," he said softly, "I know that this journey has been painful, and I don't expect you to have all the answers yet, but I want you to know that, no matter what, you have a family, with me." She looked at him, her heart swelling with a mix of emotions she could barely contain. "Thank you, Caleb. I think I'm ready to start moving forward. I don't know where this journey will take us, but I want to find out." Caleb smiled, his eyes filled with tears. "Then let's take it one step at a time." Together, they embraced, the bond between them growing stronger with each passing day, each revelation bringing them closer. Emily knew there would still be difficult moments ahead, but for the first time, she felt the strength to face them. She had a family, a real family, and no matter what challenges lay ahead, she knew she wasn't alone. Emily's newfound connection with Caleb grew stronger with each passing day. The trust and warmth she felt in his presence began to heal the scars left by Russell's manipulations. For the first time in her life, she felt free from the weight of secrets, free to explore who she truly was. She was no longer Emily defined by Russell's influence. She was becoming someone new, someone who embraced both her past and her future. One afternoon, they met at Caleb's house, where he had pulled out boxes of keepsakes from her childhood. They sat on the floor of his study, surrounded by faded photographs, tiny handprints, and school projects she had once created. Caleb handed her a small notebook with a worn cover, and as she opened it, she saw her own scribbles, a story she had started to write when she was little. "This was one of your favorites," Caleb said, his voice filled with nostalgia. "You always had such a vivid imagination. I remember you telling me stories about far-off places and brave princesses. You'd ask me to read them every night before bed." Emily smiled, tears gathering in her eyes. "I don't remember writing this, but it feels familiar, like something that's always been a part of me." They spent hours reminiscing, and with each memory they shared, Emily felt her heart open more fully. This was the connection she had always longed for, the feeling of being truly loved and cherished. She knew now that Caleb had never given up on her, that his search for her had been as relentless as his love. But even in the warmth of these moments, a lingering doubt gnawed at her. Russell's words about Caleb had cast a shadow over her thoughts for years, and though she no longer believed Russell's lies, she felt the need for closure, to hear one final truth that would put her doubts to rest. The answer came sooner than expected. A few days later, Caleb received a letter. It was postmarked from a city halfway across the country, with no return address. Caleb opened it cautiously, his hands trembling as he read the neatly typed words. As he finished, he felt his heart drop, his mind racing as he processed the contents. He knew he couldn't keep this from Emily. That evening, he invited her over, his face tense with worry as he greeted her. Emily sensed something was wrong the moment she saw him. "Caleb, what's going on?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. He took a deep breath, leading her to the study where they had spent so many afternoons reconnecting. He handed her the letter, his expression filled with pain. "Emily, I received this today. I wanted you to see it for yourself." She took the letter from his hands, her eyes scanning the words, her brow furrowing as she read. "To Caleb Prescott, you've spent years looking for your daughter, and I commend your determination. But you may want to reconsider everything you think you know. Lillian Prescott is still alive, living in another city, under a different name. The girl you've met, Emily, was never meant to be your real daughter. She was placed in your life as a decoy, a means to distract and control you. The truth is out there, if you have the courage to find it." Emily felt a cold chill settle over her as she finished reading, her hands trembling. She looked up at Caleb, her voice barely a whisper. What does this mean?" Caleb swallowed hard, struggling to keep his voice steady. "I don't know, Emily. I don't know who sent this, or why, but if it's true, then it means..." He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. The implications were too painful to speak aloud. "Then I'm not your daughter," Emily finished for him, her voice breaking. They stared at each other, the weight of the revelation settling between them like an unspoken goodbye. Emily's heart pounded as she tried to process the implications of the letter. If she wasn't Lillian, if she wasn't Caleb's daughter, then everything they had built together was based on a lie, a deception that neither of them had known they were living. For a long moment, silence filled the room, each of them lost in their own grief. But then, slowly, Caleb reached out, his hand resting on top of hers. "Emily," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "We don't know who sent this or why, but I do know one thing. These last few weeks, getting to know you, reconnecting, finding that piece of my heart I thought was lost, that's real to me. No letter, no revelation, can change what you've come to mean to me." Emily looked at him, tears streaming down her face. "But if I'm not really Lillian, then what does that make me? Just someone else?" Caleb shook his head, his gaze fierce. "No, it makes you my daughter in every way that matters. Blood doesn't make a family, Emily. Love does, and I love you, regardless of what this letter says." The raw emotion in his voice broke through her pain, and Emily felt a flicker of hope amid the despair. She had spent her entire life searching for a place to belong, a family who would love her unconditionally, and despite the shocking revelation in the letter, she realized that she had already found that family. With Caleb, they spent the rest of the evening talking, sharing their fears, their doubts, and their hopes for the future. Emily knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that the search for her true identity was far from over. But with Caleb by her side, she felt a strength she hadn't known before, a resolve to embrace whatever the future held. Before she left that night, Caleb embraced her tightly, as if he were afraid to let her go. "Whatever happens, Emily, I'm here. You're my family, my daughter, and I'll support you in whatever you decide to do next." She nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Caleb. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want you to be part of it." As she drove home, Emily felt a sense of peace she hadn't known before. She might not have all the answers, but she had something even more important. A family built on love and acceptance, a bond that went beyond blood. In the weeks that followed, they began a new journey together, searching for the truth behind her origins, the person she had been before she became Emily. Along the way, their relationship only deepened, transforming into something unbreakable, something defined not by DNA but by choice. No matter what lay ahead, Emily knew that she had finally found what she had been searching for all along: a place to belong, a father who loved her, and a future she could build on her own terms. The weeks that followed were filled with both healing and uncertainty, as Emily and Caleb embarked on a new journey together. Despite the letter's revelation casting doubt over Emily's identity, Caleb's love and commitment to her never wavered. Every day they spent together, every conversation they shared, only reinforced the bond that had grown between them. Emily found herself torn between the need for closure and the sense of family she had finally found with Caleb. Caleb, too, grappled with the truth. The letter had left him shaken, but his love for Emily was stronger than any doubt. He knew, without a shred of hesitation, that she was his daughter in every way that mattered. But he also saw the toll the revelation had taken on her, the way it cast a shadow over her newfound happiness. Caleb knew he needed to support her, no matter what choice she made. One afternoon, as they sat together on a bench overlooking a quiet lake, Caleb spoke softly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "Emily," he began, his gaze fixed on the water, "I want you to know that no matter where this journey takes you, no matter what you decide to do, I'll always be here. You're my family. That won't ever change." Emily looked down, her heart heavy yet filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Caleb. You have no idea how much that means to me." She took a deep breath, gathering the courage to voice what had been weighing on her mind. "But I think I need to find out who I really am. I need to know if there's more to my past, if the life I had was built on a lie." Caleb nodded, his expression filled with understanding and acceptance. "I understand, and I'll support you in whatever way I can. We can look into this together." Over the next few days, they began their search, reaching out to adoption agencies and seeking any records that might shed light on her history. The process was long and often frustrating, but Caleb never left her side, his unwavering presence a source of strength. One evening, after hours of combing through old documents and leads, Emily finally looked up, her expression resolute. "Caleb, I've realized something," she said, her voice steady. "Even if I find out I was never Lillian, even if I discover that my past was manipulated, it doesn't change what we have now. I know I'm your daughter in the ways that matter." Caleb's face softened, a mixture of pride and relief shining in his eyes. "Emily, you'll always be my daughter. I'm so proud of you. For your strength, for your courage. Family isn't about blood, it's about choice. And I choose you, just as you've chosen me." The days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, Emily felt more at peace. Though they uncovered fragments of her past that suggested she had indeed been used as a pawn in Russell's schemes, she let go of the need to fully untangle those lies. Instead, she focused on the life she was building with Caleb, embracing the present and the future they were creating together. One evening, as they shared dinner in Caleb's home, Emily looked at him, a warmth filling her heart. "I don't think I need to look anymore, Caleb. I've found what I was missing. I don't need any more answers." Caleb reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "Then we'll move forward together." The sense of peace that settled over them felt like a new beginning, a fresh chapter in a story they were writing together. Emily knew there would always be questions about her past, but she also knew that the love she had found with Caleb was more important than any unresolved mystery. As they embraced, each of them felt the healing power of forgiveness. the strength of a family that had been forged through resilience and love. For Emily, the journey to uncover her identity had led her back to something even more profound: a place to belong, a father who had always been waiting, and a future defined not by the past, but by the unbreakable bond they had chosen to share.